I started the YouTube live stream and we are waiting for GRTC at this time. Everyone else is here.
It looks like Emily's here.
Yeah, I'm here.
Oh, you're right. Hi, Emily. Yes. So, Emily, if you're here for Adrian, we have a quorum.
Yes, I don't believe she will be joining us.
Okay. All right. We are ready.
Great. Well, thank you everybody for coming again to hopefully our last meeting of the subcommittee. And Mr. Coleman has so graciously volunteered as today's chair. So I'll turn it over to him to get started.
Thank you, Miles. Are you going to walk us through the first three items? I guess that's the welcome. I guess the statement of virtual meetings was included in the packet. And will we proceed to the attendance?
Yes, sir. Thank you. I'll start with Goochland County, Mr. Coleman.
Here.
Hanover County, Mr. Vidunas.
Here.
Henrico County, Ms. Smidler.
Here.
City of Richmond, Ms. Clark.
Here.
GRTC, Ms. Del Ross.
Here.
DRPT, Ms. Dubinsky.
Here.
And VDOT, Ms. McAdory.
Here.
Thank you. That concludes the roll call for attendance, and we have a quorum.
Thank you, Nicole. Item number one is consideration of amendments to the agenda. Does anyone have any amendments to suggest? Hearing none, we'll move on to the second item, which is approval of the March 8, 2021 meeting summary. Is anyone prepared to make a motion for approval?
Sharon Smidler, so moved.
This is Liz, I'll second.
Thank you. All those in favor, please say aye.
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 Any opposed? Thank you. The third item, just a friendly reminder to the committee that the TPO staff is requesting action on this. It is the draft guidelines discussion and recommendation to the TAC, and I will turn it over to Mr. Bishop.
Sure, thank you. So before we get into the discussion, I just wanted to go over quickly the comments. So last meeting, we had the final draft prepared for you, and the subcommittee requested additional time to review the material since it is about 20 pages. We received comments back from one locality and from VDOT, so I did want to share those before we move on. So the comments we received from the locality, these are the 5 comments here. First one was to use the smart portal for the applications. We still haven't developed the applications. Obviously, we haven't finalized the guidelines yet, so we haven't moved forward. But we have heard a suggestion to use the smart portal from several localities, so that will be one of the options that we consider. But again, that's not something we've taken any action on or really moved forward with yet. The second was to note in the guidelines that VDOT concurrence is not required for a project that's intended to be locally administered. That's something that was easy to adjust, so we just put that in the revised guidelines that are in your packet. Number 3, I'll go back to in a little bit more detail. Number 4 was adding the interchange access request. So the IMR and IJR is now referred to as IAR. So that's basically the change. This is kind of the parent category for all of that. So we included that in the guidelines. That was an easy change. And then the last was just clarifying what a single funding swap was. I added an extra line in there just to basically state that you're allowed to push the project back one time within the 6-year program. So if you're getting up to year 1 and you're not ready, you haven't found the matching funding, you can push it back once. So that's what the single funding swap meant for leveraging. So before I move on, are there any questions on the 4 that have red notes next to them?
This is Liz. I'm sorry, did I talk over someone? Go ahead.
I'm done, sorry.
I was just going to ask, I included in my comments too, for number 2, we just need to be sure there's a clarification that's a very much a true statement, but the actual official decision. Okay, you'll cover it in the next slide, I'm sure.
Any other comments? Okay, so I appreciate that, Liz. That is something we have in your draft guidelines that we'll get into in a minute. So as far as comment number 3, this was about validation, and the comment was essentially to include the guidelines for validation in the draft framework document. Since we have to coordinate this with VDOT and it has to go through the Richmond district, we feel that it's better to leave it out of the main document. That way we have a little more flexibility to address any changes we need a little bit more quickly. So basically between VDOT and TPO staff, if we see after one round that something's not working, we don't have to go through this whole process of amending it through the policy board again. We can just make changes, push it out as part of the guidelines for the next round, and then you guys will have it. If anyone has a problem with that, please let me know today, because we can definitely include it if we need to, but we think this will give us a little bit more flexibility. So we have a proposed schedule and process for how this validation would work. So this is essentially the proposed schedule for RSTP CMAQ moving forward. So it would be July to October would be that coordination period. The July has a star because since it's coordination between the locality and VDOT and the TPO is not directly involved, you guys can really do this pretty much anytime. The end date is always going to be October. Basically, once the applications are due, we can't continue validating. So basically, the guideline would be 3 weeks before the deadline. So if it's October 31st, 3 weeks back, that would be the latest you could submit something to VDOT for the validation. In October and November, we would then have the application period and the sponsor presentations, which would replace our annual meetings that we have currently. And then TPO staff would conduct the scoring process from November through January and develop the draft allocations plan with VDOT. And then February or March, that would go to TAC, and then March or April to the TPO. These are kind of up in the air. It just depends on when we actually get the final numbers from VDOT each year. So like this year, we got it very late in February. Most years we get it earlier in February. So it just kind of depends on when we get those final numbers, when we can bring it to TAC. So in terms of the validation process, it's basically 4 steps. So the first step, the project sponsor would email TPO staff, which would essentially be whoever's in my role or Chet's role. And then you would just say, we're interested in submitting a project for RSTP CMAQ. We would do an initial screening just to say, yes, this project type is eligible for CMAQ. Basically, we don't want to waste everyone's time working on a project that's not going to be eligible for funding. And then we would send that back to you and to VDOT and CC VDOT for the planning staff. And then that basically begins the coordination. So the locality or project sponsor would reach out to VDOT. You can begin coordinating. Again, this only applies, I guess I should back up. This only applies to projects that are going to go through construction. So if for planning studies, vehicle purchase, things like that, this process doesn't apply. This is just for things that will actually go through a construction phase. So when you reach out to VDOT, you have a couple options. So the first one is validation. That's required for all the projects. So you would basically need an estimate, a schedule, and some sort of sketch to provide. And then that's where, just like with Smart Scale, they'd go through validation, review it, and say, this is what VDOT's recommendation is. And that's how we would get to that part. This is also the opportunity for a broader coordination with VDOT. So if you have a concept for a project, maybe from a comprehensive plan, but you don't have anything defined and it's not really a refined project yet, you can work with the district to actually create a better estimate, a more refined product that you could submit for funding. And then there's also the opportunity for studies. So safety studies, operational studies, STARS, arterial management, anything along those lines. You can also, through this coordination process, work with the district to try and get some of those studies done, which are kind of precursors to the next two. So in terms of timeline, validation's about 3 weeks. So that's why no later than 3 weeks before the deadline, you can submit for validation. And the studies can take a year more. So we put 12 months in there in the draft right now. And then the concept development and refinement, that's kind of an in-between, but that's not defined on here just because it really depends on the project and how far along you are. So any other questions, comments, anything on this validation process? I know this is the first time you're seeing this, but since this isn't really in the guidelines, we just wanted to make sure you had it in front of you before you got into the guidelines and the voting today.
This is Liz. I actually have a question of something that I sent you where we, validation for 3 weeks. So that was kind of the intent of that was like, that's the absolute drop dead.
Right.
You can get us something. I want to make sure whatever we publish doesn't look like 3 weeks is the typical time for validation, because that is absolutely not the case. We would like to do it as early as possible. That's just the drop dead.
Sure. And I guess to go back, so July through October, the more you can get in July and August, the easier it's going to be for VDOT as well. And this is slotted basically in between all the other programs that VDOT has to validate. So this is kind of supposed to fit between Smart Scale and everything else. And this is the window that we found that would work best. So
Right.
If you can get them in earlier, it's appreciated. But the absolute latest, as Liz said, it would be 3 weeks before the due date.
And it makes sense what you're saying to have this, I guess, more informal, and I follow the process. And I just wanted to clarify the studies of 12 months. I guess for validating, if we wanted to have a study done, it would take a year, or can you give
Right.
me an example of?
Yeah, so basically that's if let's say you have an issue or some sort of concern and you don't you need a STAR study to really figure out what the solutions are before you can submit the project. You can go through this and get the process started. So this would be looking farther ahead for a future project as opposed to the one that you need immediately. If you have something that you have an idea, but you need just the refinement, that's that concept development refinement, the second point. And that one's a quicker. That's more like what happens with Smart Scale. I think this one will be definitely beneficial for some of the smaller localities. But yes, if you need a full-blown study, it's going to take time for that to get put together.
So it wouldn't be in this round. It's just proposing it, and then maybe the next round, it may be able
Exactly.
to be validated or funded.
And that piece, less so than the other ones, is the TPO necessarily. Since we don't know what the project outcomes of that would be, we're going to be less involved and concerned about the eligibility there. But the idea is that this coordination process is more flexible than just you're coming there with a project and you have to go back and forth about cost and schedules. VDOT's trying to offer more essentially and making these resources available to.
That concept makes sense.
Hey, Miles, it's Tom Coleman. I would have a preference for the validation process to be included in the plan somehow, understanding, not wanting to lock us down this. I mean, could it be included in the appendix and just labeled something like tentative validation process or something, just so worded in a way? But I still like the idea. I prefer this to be in the document somewhere.
So I think perhaps an alternative to sticking it in the appendix that we could offer would be to include a link in the document to wherever these guidelines are. So it's not in the physical constraints of the 20 pages that we have, but it's still linked, and we could just update that easily on the website wherever it is. So it's still referenced and it's still available to whoever's looking through the guidelines, but it's just not something we'd have to edit regularly. I don't know if that would work for everyone, but that's kind of the preference is not to stick everything in the plan if we don't need to, or in the guidelines if we don't need to. That's all.
Yeah, I'm open to suggestions if that works. Just on a related matter relating to the deadline, again, I'm just not entirely comfortable with the idea that you're about the whole 3 weeks thing and the tying down the deadline. I mean, would it make sense to just move the deadline for this earlier instead of saying July 1st, say June 1st or some earlier date? Because I don't like the idea of there sort of being an unwritten rule. I would rather there be a documented rule.
So I guess I'm a little confused on what you're asking about the June versus July, Tom. But I think what we're proposing is essentially to have a written document with these guidelines so that it will be written somewhere. It's just not part of this document, I guess is what we're intending to accomplish with this. So that timeline would be specified somewhere. This process would be laid out clearly in the document. Liz has provided a draft already. It just wasn't something that we'd sent out yet because we're still reviewing and working on it. But the intent is to have something written, just not in this framework document.
That's a good answer, and I appreciate that.
Any other questions or comments on the validation process? Okay. So hearing none, we'll move on to the other comments that we received. So these were VDOT's comments on the proposed guidelines. And these I think will need a little more discussion as well, just to get feedback from the subcommittee. These changes, these comments were received too late to be incorporated into the draft that you have before you. So anything out of this would need to come as a recommendation that staff address it before it gets to TAC. So the first one here is to consider requiring the local assistance schedule tool. So basically, if you've gone through the LAP manual, there's the LAP schedule tool. So this is for the locally administered projects. In that, it's basically a spreadsheet template that you can fill out the whole project schedule, and it helps you to put everything together. It would just be part of the validation to make it helpful. Just like we have the workbooks for the estimates, this would be essentially the schedule tool that could be used. We haven't required this in the past. I mean, basically in the past, we've just gone off of start date, end date for each phase. So we wanted to get some input on this and see what the subcommittee's thoughts were on making this a requirement as well. And if you're not familiar with it, I can also pull up the spreadsheet if anyone wants to look at it.
Miles,
Yes.
so what's the primary purpose for requesting a schedule?
The primary purpose is matching funding is essentially what we're concerned about. So we need to really have a good sense of when the phases will start and how long each phase will take to be able to provide funding when it's needed. And this goes back to the overall requirement that funds be obligated within a year of allocation. So the more accurate the schedule that we can get, the better it's going to be. So that's kind of the issue here is, if we don't have the right phase dates, the schedule is off for the funding, and then we have to make more adjustments over time. And what we're trying to do with this process is essentially lock in your years, as we've kind of spelled out in the other discussions, so that we're not moving funding as often. So that's kind of the key or the concern of why we would want a more detailed schedule.
Here's the thing is that scheduling is really tough. But there's a general rule of thumb that most of these projects are going to be developed between 4 to 6 years. VDOT provides an allowance for making schedule adjustments in their dashboard up to the 30% design phase, just because of all of the uncertainties that are there when you go into a project. And I mean, I could give you, for instance, that we're dealing with right now. We had a property that we didn't consider to be historic, just be designated to be a historic property. It's probably going to add a year, well, 6 months to a year, depends, to the schedule. So it's just, I think we could spend a lot of effort and still probably kind of end up in the same place with schedule uncertainty. But I mean, it's speaking in terms of 6 months increments. I think we can pretty safely say, most projects are going to be 12 to 18 months right away, depending and so forth. But a detailed schedule as part of an application is, and I've used the tool. That's the part of my hesitation is that the tool is, it gets you down into the weeds. Again, it's if you had the answers, it would produce the perfect schedule, but there's still no guarantee.
Yeah. Hey, Miles, this is Tom, sort of concur with Joe. It does seem to be a lot of work for very little gain, that just estimating it, we could come up with comparable information.
So it
Miles?
sounds, oh,
I'm
go
sorry.
ahead.
Miles, this is Diana. I've been listening, and I think one of the things that comes up for me is the just really some of the equitable approach in it. In that I know with the city of Richmond, when it comes to the matching in regard to not having changes, sometimes our projects really depend on the funding that the TPO gives it. And so that is the, somewhat of the time frame that we're working on in order to complete the project. Just thinking of an example of, Hull Street and the phases that exist there, and really getting each of those phases funding so that the project is complete. And I'm just not sure how some of the early constraints and then impacting saying not to change for the project would impact us.
So it sounds like the subcommittee's general preference is to keep with what we've been doing, which is essentially phase start and end dates, and go from there. I don't know, Liz or Jake, if you wanted to jump in and kind of give us any reason we should consider this a little bit more in depth, if there is something I'm missing.
I mean, it was mostly, notice we said consider, just because we've found that, of course, it's not an actual science, but it usually gets the applicants closer. The bottom line is, when it comes to VDOT coordination, we're going to tell you what we think anyway. So you're going to get, you're going to get sort of that level of assistance regardless if you use the tool or do the coordination. The tool would make it a little easier for us. That was our.
Okay. So one thing I think that could be a potential, at least just a compromise in general, is, there are the templates available, and we've made those available over the past couple years during the application process. So we can make sure that we're sharing those as part of the validation process. So if you are working on developing a schedule, you can at least have those to reference as well. So that's kind of following VDOT's model for where the schedule should be, but without necessarily saying you need to go through the whole process. Does that work for everyone?
I'm happy with that.
Yes.
Okay.
I think that's a good compromise.
Okay, so we can move on from that one then. So we'll make sure to send those out as part of the, yes, your project's eligible, here's what you need to do to start validation email. The next item was VDOT requires the full estimate, even if the TPO is only requested to fund part of a project. I don't see this one as being a big issue. We have asked for the full estimate in all the applications in the past, so we'll just continue to ask for the full estimate. And I think that actually helps because you're able to demonstrate that you have some other matching or outside funding as well if we require the full estimate for the project. All right, the next two, the first one is add a caveat for the allocations process if the project cost or schedule is not compatible with the available funding. So essentially what this was referencing is if a project has a fixed schedule and it needs money in, like, let's say FY26, and we just don't have the money available in FY26, we need the flexibility to be able to skip that one if it scores higher than the others, because there's just not funding available. And then the same thing if the cost, if there's a more expensive project that scores higher, but there's just not enough money to be able to fund that one, and we can fund something that's a lower priority, we need the flexibility to be able to skip that and move down to one that we can fund as well. The guidelines as they're proposed, as you have them in the packet, essentially say that the new project allocations are based on priority and available funding. Staff feels that that's pretty flexible and we could accommodate those situations that way. And that would just be a discussion with VDOT on how to handle it. But if the subcommittee would want to put something more in writing, like how Smart Scale says that you keep going until you can't fully fund the next project, or something along those lines, we can definitely include that as well. But we wanted to give you the opportunity to weigh in on this as well, since it's not in your draft.
That makes sense, what you're saying about smart scale until they can't fund it anymore, or with more funds being eligible for leveraging, could the locality or sponsor be given the opportunity saying, can you provide the remaining balance before they went on to a lower priority project?
So essentially saying, would you be willing to commit to a partial funding solution, essentially?
Yeah.
I mean, I think we could be open to that. My only concern is sort of the same situation that we have with Smart Scale. If we go into it and somebody's already committed to providing outside funding for the rest of the project and somebody hasn't going into it, then we're giving them an extra opportunity to catch back up. And I know the concern with Smart Scale is always that that makes an imbalance between the larger localities and the smaller localities who are less able to provide those matches. So I'm open to hearing what the rest of the subcommittee says, but I think we could definitely accommodate that if that's the direction we want to go.
Yeah, this is Diana. Yeah, because I think when you think about giving the extra opportunity to catch up versus continuing to fund those localities that have matching funds, I think that some consideration, some extra consideration for those localities may be helpful, because otherwise, again, you are rewarding localities that have the money to provide the match by moving down to a project that's more ready or ready to go than the other.
Anyone else have any thoughts on this? Because it sounds like right now we're maybe a little split on the direction to go here.
So what is the process now?
Sure. So our
I know I
process
should be able to answer that.
yeah, our process now is basically we generally follow the priority order, but occasionally there's just a project that's much smaller. Usually it's something like a study that, you know, it's easy to fit in a couple $100,000 where we can't fit in projects that are millions of dollars. So we may skip down several items to get to a project that we could fund again. And that generally tends to benefit the bike ped or the study type projects, the lower cost projects is basically how it works out in practice.
And that makes sense to me, what you guys have been doing in that priority, and then if it doesn't fit, using it for studies or some smaller amounts. Thank you for explaining that.
Yeah, I think that if that would be then the policy for those types, then that would be acceptable.
Is everybody else okay with that? Just continuing what we've been doing of skipping down to the lower cost projects that are able to be funded? Okay. So not hearing anybody opposed, I think we'll just keep it with the way it's written now and just handle that as a procedural side of things, because I don't think there's really need to change that language, keep it flexible for ourselves. The next one is really, this is just an informational item for you guys, but we're changing our balance entry UPCs. So we have an RSTP and a CMAQ UPC, and then we also have the 101492, which is the regional projects UPC that we use for balances. We have 3 of them, and we mostly use the 101492. The recommendation from VDOT is to have a separate RSTP and CMAQ balance entry, which is what all the other MPOs are doing. So we're getting rid of the 101492 and going back to having 2 separate UPCs. So basically what we have to do is remove the references. So there are a few still in the document to a specific UPC, and we're just going to be removing those before this goes to TAC, unless anyone has concerns with that. Okay, hearing none, move on to the last comment. So this is another one that we think will need discussion. basically for the guidelines for allocating, what it states in the draft document is that if a project's phase costs more than 25% of what's available in that year, you can split it. So instead of giving someone $10 million all in one year, they could get 5 million or 4 million, and then the balance in later out years, as long as it works with the project schedule. The point being, we don't want one project to take up all of the funding and make it hard to select others. We have it at 25%. VDOT's recommendation was to consider either using a dollar threshold or having both in there. The dollar is much more straightforward to administer since it's a set amount. So we're open to either direction. If you guys want to change it, we can. If not, we can just leave it at the 25%. I think either way, it gets us to the same place. I guess I should say it's just a question of how we want to write it in the document. Is it a dollar number or a percentage number?
Miles, I'm not a voting member, but just to help facilitate the conversation, I didn't work this closely this year, but with Larry and doing the allocations. But when you were working back and forth with him, was this something that we went up against multiple times, or was this a one-off, like one? How often does this situation occur? Is what I'm trying to ask.
We have quite a few projects that would hit these thresholds. And I think those were, especially in the RSTP side this year, were the projects that were harder to start programming just because the funding got cut. So the benefit of having the 25% as opposed to a fixed number is when the funding goes down, it gives us more flexibility that even smaller projects can be split over multiple years. So like in this case, if we were expecting $20 million and we only had 17 for FY22. So because of that decrease with the percentage, we would also be able to split projects that were below whatever the fixed number is.
Right.
So that's the benefit of the percentage. But we can work either way. It's just a question of how we work with Larry on it, really.
And it seems like, and I'm just, throwing out stuff for conversation. It seems like the percentage might be the more equitable way, just because it's a percentage as opposed to, let's say the threshold were $1 million. I know that's a ridiculously low amount, but if it's $1 million on a $2 million project, that's one thing. But if it's $1 million on a $20 million project, the percentage would be a more equitable way to do it. Again, I'm not a voting member, just throwing it out.
So does anyone else have any strong preferences one way or the other?
I think Liz made a good point in regard to the percentage.
So I think, so I'm not hearing anything else. Our preference is just to keep it at the percentage amount right now. And that's just, it's already in the draft, so we wouldn't need to change anything. And like I said, I think it's a little more complex to administer, but I think it gets us more flexibility when funding goes up or down.
That sounds good, Miles.
Okay. All right. Well, that's all the comments that we received. So I didn't hear anything that we need to revise the document today. It sounds like what we need to do is make those changes before it goes to TAC and include the link to the guidelines for validation as somewhere in the document as well, which we can accomplish both of those before we take the full draft to TAC. So what we're requesting today, you had the extra month to review the document. So what we're requesting is a recommendation on these guidelines to the full TAC. So then we can put it on the TAC agenda for May and get it to the TPO by June, so we can try and use these guidelines for next year's application process. So with that, I'm happy to answer any other questions you have, or we'd just like to open it up to any discussion, and I'll turn it back over to our chair.
Thank you, Miles. Yeah, if there's any more discussion on this, please speak now. If there is no other discussion, is there anyone willing to introduce a motion to recommend approval of this?
This is Joe. I'll move for approval.
Sharon Smidler, second.
Thank you. All those in favor of the motion, please say aye.
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 Is there anyone opposed to the motion? The ayes have it. I think, Miles, does that conclude our business for today?
Nicole, we don't need to do a roll call, do we?
I would say that's up to the chair. A roll call
Okay.
would be appropriate if that's preferred.
I think I'll leave that up to you, Tom, but since we didn't hear any dissent, I think,
I did not hear any dissent, so I think it was approved by, I guess, acclamation.
That works. Thank you.
well, that's everything I had on the agenda for you guys today.
Thank you. I guess that concludes our meeting today. Thank everyone. Have a good day.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you for your work, Miles.
Bye, y'all. Thanks.
Good job, Miles.